Hi, so we're back in experimental psych. Welcome. And now we'll be talking about specific research designs in experimentation. So here you can see we have two general types. One is a true experiment, the other is a quasi experiment. So you know from our previous topic that for a study to be considered a true experiment, dapat it should include manipulation, comparison, and randomization. And you know what those three things mean. So we're gonna go and look at each of the true experimental research designs one by one. And then in the next video, we're gonna talk about the quasi experimental research designs. But now, for starters, let's take a potential problem and see how we could study it using the different experimental research designs. Okay, so let's say there's this girl, and this girl is very bright, just like you guys are, but she's also a very anxious student, right? She's a very anxious student. And you know, right, that when it's exam time, usually a lot of things happen. But one of the things that potentially happen during an exam is what we call choking. Okay? So you know what physiological and physical choking is, right? But what we're talking about here is psychological choking, right? So this is what happens when, say, you have your test paper right in front of you, you've prepared very well for your exams, you've studied days before, and you're really ready. But then the moment you start reading the first question in your exam, everything starts to blur out. Okay? So you mentally black out and you forget what you're supposed to answer, even though you know you've actually prepared for the exam very well. Okay? So choking is basically what happens when you get a sort of an anxiety attack before a performance, and that causes you to perform less than your best, less than the potential that you could actually give during that said performance. And we know that in academics, especially, that can affect our grades, that can affect our esteem. In sports, it's also something that's often studied, right? Choking. Even sometimes even the best players, the best athletes also choke. Dancers, singers, at some point we probably all experienced choking, right? But as psychologists or mental health professionals, what we want is to help people control choking. We want to find a way to help this girl and make sure that the next time she takes her exams, she won't choke, or she won't choke as much or as often. Now, how are we going to do that? Okay, let's see. So what we do, of course, we go back and read scientific literature. Yay! Okay, so let's say you've been reading a lot of scientific papers, right? Researching all over the internet, and now you came across something interesting. Okay, you realize that it may be worth it to consider journaling. Okay? So, journaling, what is journaling? Right? You're all familiar with journaling. It's basically when you write down your thoughts and feelings on paper, express your thoughts, express things you might not normally be able to verbalize to other people or even to yourself. And we know from literature that journaling has been used to help treat a number of mental health conditions, right? Alongside other things such as psychotherapy. So we know it's very helpful, but what we want to see here is, can journaling help decrease or eliminate choking in written exams, because specifically we're talking about a written exam here, right? Okay, so what we need to be able to do now is to define what we mean by choking and what we mean by journaling, because those two things are going to be our research variables, right? Okay, so your IV is going to be journaling, and your DV is gonna be choking. Okay, so what do you hope to see? Well, you hope to see that the students who journal are the ones who are no longer going to choke, or who are going to choke less. Okay, but we don't know how we're gonna do that yet. So we may want to look at the different research designs. Okay. So the first one is what we call a randomized two group design. So we look at the name, it's randomized. So definitely. And so how do we write that down? So we say R. Okay. And then once you've randomly assigned people, so randomly assign them, one will be, so a set of students will go to the control group, another set of students will go to the experimental group. Okay, so definitely the people in the experimental group will have to do journaling prior to their exams, and then both groups are gonna have to take the same exam. Okay, and then we're gonna see what happens to their results. Okay, so this is basically, this is journaling, and then this is going to be a written exam. Okay, so choking, we're going to measure choking by looking at how well or how bad did the students perform after the intervention was given. So what do we hope to see? We hope to see that the students in the experimental group will perform better in their written exams, which may indirectly tell us that there's less choking that happened there. So that's your randomized two group design. Okay. However, you have a number of problems here, right? So you know from reliability and validity in experimental research, there are a lot of things that could go wrong in the analysis of your simple randomized two group design. And so another model that we could use is the two group pretest post-test design, which I think is very familiar to you already, because this is what we use during our outreach, and this is one of the common examples that I give in class. But anyway, so first we start out by randomly assigning people to the control group and the experimental group. So we have control and your experimental group. Okay, but prior to the actual experiment, both groups are gonna take a pre-test, and then these scores, okay, so these two scores have to be compared to see how well they're doing when compared with each other. So is the control group performing better already compared to your experimental group, or are they performing at a pretty much the same level? Okay, and of course, for our experimental group, we are going to assign them some journaling work. Oh, sorry. So we're gonna give them a journal to work on, but for the control group, that's just that. And then after, we are going to give both groups their post test. Post test, right? Which is also O1 and O2. Okay. So using this design, we're able to sort of estimate the ability of the two groups, such that if, let's say, the experimental group gets a very high score after the intervention, we can dismiss the thought, oh, well, maybe it's because the experimental group was better in the first place, because we have an idea of their baseline performance based on our pretest, right? So we know if they get considerably higher scores, it's not just because they were initially better in the first place. However, please note that this design is prone to the problem of practice effects, because the students have had access to the measuring tool prior to the study. So especially if there's a very small gap between the pre-testing and the post-testing. So if they're familiar with the exam, it's likely going to improve their scores. Okay. So we make accommodations by designing our study differently. We may instead use the Solomon 4 group design. So in the Solomon 4 group design, what we do is, again, we randomly assign people to different groups, and then we make 4 instead of just 2 groups, right? So what are these 4 groups? So the first one is control A, and then we have experimental A, and then we have control B, and we have experimental B. So why 4 groups? Because we are going to combine the randomized 2 group design with the pretest post-test design. So for control A and experimental A, we are going to give them a pretest. Pretest, right? Yeah. So that should give us a baseline of their performance. Whereas for control B and experimental B, we are not going to give them a pretest. Okay, so we're not going to know what the baseline data is about them. Okay. And then we are going to ask experimental group A and experimental group B. Okay. We're going to ask them to journal prior to the exams. And then after that, everyone is going to take a post-test. Post-test. Okay. So everyone is going to take a post-test. And we are going to compare the scores. So, what do we hope to see? Well, we hope to see that in all these cases, sana the scores of the students from this group and this group are considerably higher than the other two groups. Okay, but of course we wouldn't know unless we run the actual experiment. But then what is the benefit of having four different groups, right? So here, since we don't have baseline data of their ability or their performance, we get to compare still, from what we know, the influence of journaling on them minus the problem of practice effects. So whatever their score is in the control group, whatever their score is in the post-test, and the same with the experimental group, whatever their score is in the post-test, we can say it's not because of practice effects. It's not because they were familiar with the exams. That's why there was an increase in the score. However, since we don't know whether we have pretty balanced groupings in terms of ability, we can also answer that by looking at the results of the pretest of control A and experimental A. So if we see that there's no significant difference in the abilities of these two groups, when we look at their post-test scores, and one group scores higher, way higher than the other, we can probably say then that, it was most likely an influence of the intervention that we gave. Okay? So I hope you're with me. We're gonna stop here and then we're gonna continue with another research.